Okay, hey everyone, Dogen here. Welcome to the public release of Japanese Phonetics episode 33. This is the episode on devoicing. Like in the past, another one of my patrons came forward and said, hey Dogen, I thought that this video in particular was really interesting and would be really useful for a lot of Japanese learners. If I paid you like that other patron did in the past, would you be willing to release this to the public? And I said, yeah, for sure, let's do it. So here we are. The lesson is now available on YouTube for everyone to see. And like in the past, I'm going to be doing some kind of supplementary notes to this lesson. And if anyone's wondering, this is the Dogen merch that finally arrived to my place in Japan. I'll leave a link below if anyone is interested in this. But I think that's probably good for an intro for now. Again, I'm really happy that I'm able to release this lesson because devoicing in general, I think, can make a real big difference, especially for beginners. So hope that you guys enjoy the video. Let's just get into it right now. Hi everyone and welcome to the 33rd episode of Japanese Phonetics by Dogen. In this episode, which is the first of the pronunciation sub-series, we'll be looking at devoicing. I'm really excited to start talking about pronunciation, particularly devoicing, and that is because of all of the single independent rules that exist in Japanese phonetics. Devoicing had by far the largest impact on my spoken Japanese, and I imagine it will for many of you as well. This isn't an extremely high-level concept, so I imagine that many of the more advanced learners will already know a good deal of what we'll be learning today, but I still hope that the way we cover it proves to be beneficial. Okay, with that out of the way, let's begin, starting things off with a quick anecdote. When I began studying Japanese at university, my end goal was to one day speak with a native-like accent. Rather than knowing thousands of kanji, I wanted to sound like a Japanese person, so I was fairly concerned with pronunciation from the get-go, even before I knew what phonetics was. I asked a lot of questions about pronunciation in class, recorded myself from time to time, and tried to hang out with as many native speakers as I could. Because of this, I had a lot of pride when it came to my pronunciation, a comical amount of pride really. This pride in turn made me hyper aware of other Japanese learners' pronunciation. I never cared if someone knew more grammar than me, but if they had better pronunciation than me, I basically went into a state of denial. While I can talk like that, I would tell myself, often mimicking whatever they said under my breath. There was one definitive instance, however, when I heard a half Japanese, half American student say a seemingly simple phrase that I couldn't mimic, and it drove me crazy. I knew that he was saying the phrase correctly, and I didn't know why I couldn't say the phrase correctly, why I kept getting caught up. The phrase was an informal "wanna go," which is written like this. Don't worry about saying this right now, we'll get into the details in just a minute. The point is that no matter how many times I tried to say this phrase like this student, I couldn't, and that is because the Japanese pronunciation rules that I unconsciously played by, the rules that I was taught when I began learning Japanese, were wrong. When learning Japanese pronunciation, most people come across a variant of the following phrase. Japanese pronunciation is easy because there are only 5 vowels and 14 consonants, which, unlike their English counterparts, are always pronounced the same. In other words, while in English I can be pronounced as I, e, etc., in Japanese I will always be pronounced as I. Ts is always ts, P is always P, Ku is always ku, and on and on. This, much like Japanese intonation is flat, is a gross oversimplification which, when believed, and most people believe it because it's what they're taught, greatly limits the naturalness of once spoken Japanese. If all sounds are always pronounced the same was true, then the phrase "wanna go" pronounced quickly would be ikuka, which my 18-year-old self would have had no trouble mimicking. But it's not true, which is why the phrase "wanna go" said quickly is not ikuka, but ikuka. Note the difference.
行くか、行くか、行くか、行くか、行くか、行くか。
So, what exactly is going on here? Devoicing. Let's explore this phenomenon in detail. In spoken language, there are vowels and consonants. Vowels, put very simply, are sounds that are said with an open vocal tract through the vibration of the vocal cords. The second part of this phrase is key. When you produce a vowel, you engage your vocal cords. Try putting your fingers against your throat while saying the 5 Japanese vowels to confirm this. A, I, U, E, O. As you undoubtedly notice, when you make any of these sounds, your vocal cords vibrate. Independent vowels like this are voiced sounds because we engage our vocal cords when producing them. On the other hand, consonants are sounds in which your breath is at least partially obstructed. Consonants can be either voiced or unvoiced. T, for example, is an unvoiced consonant. Try making a T sound while putting your fingers against your throat. T, 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 t. No vibration, right? Again, this is because T is an unvoiced consonant. How about D? D, 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 D. With this consonant, our vocal cords are engaged. Thus, D is a voiced consonant. This actually is the only difference between T and D. For T and D, everything is in the same place. Our tongue, our lips, our jaw, etc. We simply engage our vocal cords to create a D. T, da, t, da, t, da. Now, all of you have definitely noticed this, but in Japanese, the T and D sounds are actually represented by the same characters. The only difference is this mark, the Dogen, which literally means voice mark. Now, while both ta and da end voiced with the vowel a, da actually begins voiced as well, which is why it has a Dogen, a voice mark. Ta begins unvoiced because it doesn't have a voice mark. Ta, ta. Note this difference. Ta, da.
Ta, da, ta, da.
Now, there are several other sounds in Japanese that have Dogen or voice marks. The G sounds, for example, are simply the K sounds with Dogen. Again, this is because the only difference between K and G sounds is that when we say G sounds, we engage our vocal cords. Ka, ga. G is a voiced K. Likewise, Z's are voiced S's, B's are voiced P's, and so on and so forth. So in Japanese, there are some sounds that start voiced and other sounds that become voiced halfway through. A Japanese linguist noticed this back in the day and constructed the Japanese alphabet to reflect it in a practical manner. Okay, this knowledge is interesting, but it doesn't yet change the way we say independent sounds in Japanese. In other words, we now know that ku doesn't begin voiced, but this doesn't change the way that we say ku. Here's where things get interesting. In linguistics, there are predictable voicing and devoicing phenomena. This essentially means that sounds predictably change based on whether or not the surrounding sounds are voiced or not. For example, in the English word cups, the S is pronounced as a normal unvoiced S because the preceding consonant, P, is an unvoiced consonant. P, is unvoiced, so S is unvoiced as well due to voicing momentum, so to speak. On the other hand, if we look at the word cubs, as in baby bears, we notice a different phenomenon. Here, the S at the end of the word is pronounced more like a Z than an S. Cubs, not cubus, right? Cubs, not cubus, right? The S receives some voice because the preceding sound, B, bu, is a voiced consonant. So we say cubs. Cubs. It's actually kind of difficult and unnatural to say cubs. You kind of get hung up, right? This is exactly what was happening to me when I was trying to say ikuka. Just like how an English S can make both S and Z sounds, a Japanese I can be partially or fully devoiced, and a Japanese ku can make both ku and k sounds, depending on the surrounding sounds. But if you don't know this and you always try and say I as I and ku as you're taught, not only does it make your Japanese sound more unnatural, it actually makes it more difficult to speak at a reasonable speed. Japanese sounds are always pronounced the same is a gross oversimplification. There are many sounds in Japanese that have multiple pronunciations, and we're going to start looking at these today by exploring how devoicing occurs in Japanese. In Japanese, we often learn a very simple form of devoicing early on with the word des. We usually say des rather than desu because there isn't a voiced sound that follows su. This is a great example of the devoicing phenomenon that occurs in Japanese. I'll be repeating this several times for emphasis. In Japanese, the high vowels I and U get devoiced when in between unvoiced consonants. In Japanese, the high vowels I and U get devoiced when in between unvoiced consonants. In other words, we do not engage our vocal cords for I and U when they are found between any pair of unvoiced consonants. Let's apply this concept to the phrase that we started with, ikuka. If we look at the individual sounds in this phrase, we see I, ku, ka. As we can see, both the ku and the ka do not have Dogen or voice marks. They begin with the unvoiced consonant k. K. Let's make this a bit easier by displaying the romaji for this word. Okay, now what was the rule again? The high vowels I and U get devoiced when between any pair of unvoiced consonants. Take a good look at the romaji for this phrase. As you can see, the U is between two Ks, two unvoiced consonants. Thus, the U gets devoiced. We do not engage our vocal cords when saying it. So, rather than saying ku, we just say k with no vowel. I, ku, ka becomes I, k, ka, iku ka.
行くか。行くか。
Much easier to say than ikuka, right? If you're having a bit of trouble mimicking this phrase, don't worry. The same thing happened to me the first few times I tried. I heard the Japanese students say the correct ikuka, but I kept saying ikuka because I kept unconsciously trying to voice the u in ku. Remember that this is wrong. Ku is not always ku. Relax and rid yourself completely of the sounds are always the same mindset. Ku is sometimes ku, but sometimes it's the completely unvoiced ku. Perhaps try thinking about this phrase as if it was spelled like this. Iku ka, iku ka, iku ka.
行くか。行くか。行くか。
Did you find it a bit easier? As you probably noticed, when we allow ourselves not to say the u here, we can say the whole phrase much faster. Iku ka, iku ka. This is because it's simply much more natural not to voice high vowels between devoiced consonants. This is in fact a universal rule in linguistics that shows up in literally dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of other languages. Okay, before going over more examples, let's look at the guidelines one more time. In Japanese, the high vowels I and U get devoiced when found between any pair of unvoiced consonants. Let's make this a bit more specific. I and U will become devoiced when found between any of the following: K, S, T, CH, H, and P. As you'll notice, these are the sounds in Japanese that also have dakten or voiced counterparts. It's also important to mention that I and U often, but not always, become partially or completely devoiced when there isn't a following sound. This is why des is said as des rather than desu, because there isn't a sound, a voiced sound, that comes after the su. Okay, so this is the first point that I would like to give some additional information on. First, I said I and U can get devoiced if there is no following sound. And this is what's happening in this. And I added this in a title after the fact, and you guys probably just saw the title, but in order for I or U to get devoiced at the end of a word when there's no following sound, the sound that comes before the vowel, so in des, the sound that comes before the U, that sound also has to be a voiceless sound. So a I or U can't just come at the end of a word. It has to come at the end of a word, and the consonant before it also has to be a voiceless sound. So every time you hear a speaker saying ikimasu or yarimasu or whatever mas word it might be, the reason that they're not properly saying the U at the end is because not only is there no following sound, but because the sound before U is that voiceless S. Again, S, it's voiceless. S's voiced counterpart is Z. If you say S, and Z, back to back, you'll notice that when you say Z, your vocal cords are vibrating, but with S, they're not. So I apologize for the sloppy terminology. Again, proper devoicing only occurs when I or U are found between voiceless consonants or when they are preceded by a voiceless consonant and followed by a pause. There's still a lot of information left in this lesson, so let's just get back to it. Great, now let's look at some more examples, starting with some simple words. The word for person, hito, hito. Here, the E is found between two unvoiced consonants, H and T. Thus, the E becomes devoiced. This is why we say hito rather than hito.
人、人、人、人、人、人。
Likewise, in the word 人々, the initial E is not voiced, but the second E is voiced because it follows a voiced consonant, B, 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 人々.
人々、人々、人々。
Another example, 器具 versus 聞く. Don't worry about the pitch accent here, just concentrate on the pronunciation. In 器具, the E is voiced, at least partially, because the following consonant, G, 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 is a voiced consonant. 器具, 器具. On the other hand, in 聞く, as in listen, the E is not voiced because the following consonant, K, 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 is an unvoiced consonant. Compare the ki sound in these two. 器具, 聞く,
器具、器具、器具、聞く、聞く、聞く。
A few more E examples. 七味, not し, 七味.
七味、七味、七味。
色彩, し, く, not し, き. 色彩.
色彩、色彩、色彩。
来てよ. き, not き. 来てよ.
来てよ、来てよ、来てよ。
And a few U examples. Here we'll start with a slightly more complicated example. Accento. Accento. Is the U voiced here? Well, it occurs between a K, K, K and an S, S, S. These are both unvoiced consonants. Thus, the U becomes devoiced. Again, not K, but K. Accento. Accento.
アクセント、アクセント、アクセント。
福岡. F, not ふ. 福岡.
福岡、福岡、福岡。
Are you starting to get the hang of it? Now, earlier we talked about how there are many Japanese words and phrases that are almost impossible to say if you believe this. All sounds are always the same misconception. Let's try looking at some of these now. Notice how much easier it is to say these in a natural, native-like way once you stop trying to voice the I and U vowels. I'm exhausted. Kuta da. Kuta da. Kuta da.
くたくただ、くたくただ、くたくただ。
Again, if we try and spell this word phonetically, it's much closer to kuta kuta than kuta kuta, kuta kuta. I'm exhausted. My body is done. もう体がクタクタだよ. もう体がクタクタだよ.
もう体がくたくただよ。もう体がくたくただよ。もう体がくたくただよ。
Much easier to say than kuta kuta, right? And it sounds 100% more natural. A couple more examples. It's completely empty. スカスカだ. スカスカだ. スカスカだ.
スカスカだ。スカスカだ。スカスカだ。
Like before, if it helps, try thinking about the pronunciation as this rather than ska ska.
スカスカだ。スカスカだ。
And a few verbs. Let's start with できる. The ki is voiced here because it is preceding a voiced consonant, an R. Ra, 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 ra. But in its past form, this R becomes a T, and this I gets devoiced because T, 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 is an unvoiced consonant. Thus, not de kita, but dekita, dekita, k, dekita.
できた。できた。 できた。
This may seem a little bit trivial, but it actually really helps when saying the same verb twice in a row, which actually happens a fair amount in Japanese, as in, お、できたできた, or 起きた起きた, or あ、来た来た。
できたできた。できたできた。できたできた。起きた起きた。起きた起きた。起きた起きた。来た来た。来た来た。来た来た。
It also helps a lot with verb combinations that end with 来た, as in 買ってきた、起こしてきた、走ってきた、食べてきた、してきた、見てきた、etc. etc.
買ってきた。買ってきた。買ってきた。起こしてきた。起こしてきた。起こしてきた。走ってきた。走ってきた。走ってきた。食べてきた。食べてきた。食べてきた。してきた。してきた。してきた。見てきた。見てきた。見てきた。
All of these become much easier to say with a proper understanding of devoicing. First, if the downstep or accent of a word happens to come on a devoiced vowel, then it's okay to voice this vowel. For example, in the verb tsukusu, the downstep occurs on the ku. Now, because the second u here is between a k and an s, it should get devoiced, but again, it's okay to pronounce it as tsukusu because the downstep falls here. Regardless of devoicing rules, downstep vowels are sometimes voiced. Okay, and this is the second section I'd like to give some additional information on. So the example that I just gave, tsukusu, there are some older pitch accent dictionaries that indicate that devoicing doesn't affect accented mora. So in tsukusu, again, the ku is the accented mora, and if we believe the older pitch accent dictionaries that say that this accented mora shouldn't receive devoicing, shouldn't be affected by devoicing, then that's one theoretical possibility for why the ku is not being devoiced. That being said, I think there's one additional plausible thing going on here, and that's that if there are multiple sounds in a word, or multiple kind of syllables in a Japanese word that should all, technically speaking, receive devoicing, oftentimes if there's 2 or 3 of those in a row, then as a result of that, even like entire words can get devoiced. And if that happens, then the word doesn't carry any pitch at all. And that sounds odd to native Japanese speakers. So in tsukusu, each of the u's in this word could, technically speaking, be devoiced because of the structure of the word. However, if you devoiced all of the u's in this word, which again, technically speaking, you could, then the final pronunciation would be tsukus, tsukus. And you wouldn't say any vowels, and again, the word would carry no pitch. So again, we just talked about how it's plausible that ku isn't being devoiced because it's the accented mora, the accented syllable of this word. But another plausible theory is that if you did devoice ku, and as well as the surrounding sounds, then the word wouldn't carry any pitch at all, and that would be off. So this is one of the reasons that the word socks, which I'll write out here, has multiple correct pronunciations. Because if you devoice the ku, the tsu, and the shi, then it's kutsushita, kutsushita. And that sounds weird to native speakers. So rather than devoicing the ku, the tsu, and the shi, in that word, oftentimes native speakers will not devoice the second sound, as in kutsushita, kutsushita, and partially or fully articulate the u, again, as in kutsushita. That way, again, it's not kutsushita. And the final thing that I'd like to mention is that there are some native speakers that do devoice accented syllables. We said that it's okay to not devoice these, but there are certainly some speakers that do. But if, again, you devoice the accented syllable, then the accent essentially disappears from the word in terms of pitch, because if a sound has been devoiced, then it doesn't carry any pitch at all. You're just essentially whispering rather than engaging your vocal cords again. And you need to engage your vocal cords to create kind of a proper pitch. But if an accented mora doesn't experience any pitch at all, then that accent is essentially disappearing from the word. And in those instances, sometimes native speakers will pronounce that word with an additional pronunciation, like a different pitch accent pattern. So one quick example would be the word for announcer. If we say this word slowly, it's ki-sha. But if we say this word quickly, then it's kisha. And devoicing does occur on the i. But if devoicing occurs on the i, then that downstep, kisha, the pitch is disappearing. So the pitch accent is no longer there. And some people will just say kisha as if it was there, but other speakers will say kisha and give the word a different pitch accent pattern. The basic theory is that if an accent is devoiced, then the pitch accent pattern of the word needs to change in order to kind of compensate for this. This is, again, one of the reasons that you can see multiple pitch accent patterns for words in pitch accent dictionaries. So that was kind of a lot of information on the relationship, kind of the way that pitch accent and devoicing interact with each other. But again, I think that the important thing with this particular section, the main takeaway point should just be that if you find an instance in which devoicing should technically be occurring, but it's not, oftentimes, though not all of the time, it's because of the way that pitch accent and devoicing are interacting with each other. And rather than trying to memorize those three examples that I just gave, I would just try and memorize what I just said, that pitch accent and devoicing interact with each other, and sometimes this affects either the pitch accent pattern of the word and or if devoicing occurs. I think that if you just try and be aware of this while you listen for devoicing and while you listen to native Japanese, that'll probably be better than trying to really memorize everything that I just said. And with that said, let's get back to the closing thoughts section of the video.
Okay, closing thoughts on devoicing. Devoicing is one of the most important phenomena in Japanese phonetics. However, if you try and remember the rule and the guidelines in their entirety, things can get a bit overwhelming. Instead, start by trying to untangle any Japanese sounds are always the same beliefs and by searching for instances in which I and U get devoiced in spoken Japanese. If you start actively listening for this, you'll immediately begin to notice it all the time and quickly develop a sixth sense for how to reproduce the effect. As noted earlier, most advanced learners will know about devoicing already, at least to a certain degree, but in my experience, I've noticed that most of them learn it on a word-by-word basis. In the beginning, they see that desu is des and suki is ski. A few months later, they begin to say hito rather than hito. And eventually, several years down the road, they properly devoice almost all, if not all, words in a conversation. Through many years of listening osmosis, so to speak, they come to realize unconsciously that hikiokosu, for example, is pronounced hikiokosu and not hiki-okosu. We don't want to do this. We don't want to have a native say a single word 40 or 50 times before we realize that it's not pronounced the same way that our first-year textbooks would have us believe. We don't want to pick up this rule through a gradual listening osmosis. We want to flip a switch and immediately have access to the ability. We want to know by looking at a word just once or hearing a word just once whether or not it experiences devoicing. Start actively listening for devoicing in spoken Japanese and your devoicing gears will begin to turn. And next time you find yourself getting hung up on a word or phrase, try asking yourself, should I be devoicing here? Okay guys, that's all for this lesson. I hope that you found it useful. As we saw in this episode, Japanese sounds are not always pronounced the same, and we'll see more and more instances of this in upcoming episodes with sounds such as ni, ko, ga, just to name a few. I have a few ideas in mind for episode 2 of this pronunciation sub-series, but Devoicing is a really critical rule, and I have a feeling that there might be a fair number of questions. So depending on the response to this video, I'm contemplating releasing a devoicing follow-up in maybe 7 or 8 days rather than waiting 2 weeks to release a new video on an unrelated topic. So just let me know what you guys think of this idea. All right, that's all for today. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to leave a comment below. Thank you very much for the continued support, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
So that's the lesson. I hope that everyone enjoyed it. Again, I think that the main takeaway point from this lesson, rather than trying to remember the exact rule, which if anyone is interested, is that the high vowels I and U get devoiced between voiceless consonants or between a voiceless consonant and a pause at the end of a word. I think, again, rather than trying to remember that, just try and be conscious. Try and listen for instances of I and U getting devoiced in native speech. If you just listen for this actively, and you're a beginner especially, you'll immediately start to notice it. And once you start noticing it, you'll start to naturally reproduce the effect. As mentioned at the end of this video, I did end up making a follow-up lesson that's still a Patreon exclusive video. So if anyone's interested in that, you can head over to my Patreon. I intend on making a couple small changes to that video in the near future as well. Kind of similar to what I did with this video, with this style. There's a couple of little things that I'd like to touch on, but I think that's enough for promoting this series. Thank you again to Sufyan for making this release to the public possible, and hopefully I'll be able to do this again in the future. But I'll just end the video here. Thank you again, everyone, for your continued support, and I'll talk to all you guys again soon. Sayonara.